Hola, everybody. Welcome back to the Chats with Yvonne podcast with me, your host, Yvonne Armenta. I talk about public speaking because I love it and I want to help you love it too. In this podcast, we take a deep dive into the art of public speaking to talk about topics that, whether we realize it or not, are connected to the art and our journey with it. Public speaking can be scary, but my hope is that by tapping into a variety of topics, we can find a deeper connection and love for the art because it can literally help you grow and in turn, help our communities. Today's topic is on public speaking as a tool for creating meaningful and positive change in our communities. Public speaking is activism. I recorded part of this podcast shortly after the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. I was so upset, I was sad, but most importantly, I was moved to action. I wanted to understand what I could do. Y mi granito de arena is through the art of public speaking. I want to start off by defining what granito de arena is because I refer to it throughout the episode. The English translation is grain of sand. There's a documentary produced in 2005 called Granito de Arena about teachers, parents, and students fighting to defend Mexico's public education system from the impacts of economic globalization. I haven't yet watched it and didn't really even know about it until I was looking for the exact definition of Granito de Arena. I'll be watching that though, and I think we really all should. The sentiment around Granito de Arena for me has always been about how can I contribute to a cause? The smallest of things can make a huge difference because if every one of us supports a cause or supports our community just a little every day, eventually we'll create a big mountain of sand, aka having that positive impact. Public speaking is activism. How many times have you been moved to action by someone's words? How many times have you advocated for something you're deeply passionate about? I'm disgusted by a lot of things happening in the world today. I have been for a long time. And like many of us, I have opinions. Some are informed by personal feelings and experiences, by facts, but most of all, informed by my love for people and the belief that everyone deserves to live life on their terms. The continued attack on women's rights to choose, that people think that the government or anyone for that matter should have control over somebody's body, makes me want to throw up, literally. Like many, it's been top of mind for me since it happened, and it pains me to think that I was one of the ignorant people that believed this could never happen, that this could never be the direction my country decided to take. And I know it's weird, but I feel weird even saying like my country, like America. I am not proud. It's embarrassing because yes, this decision is so disgusting, but not unimaginable. Many community activists tried to tell us, and we just didn't listen close enough. Our communities have been advocating for safer and accessible abortions for our communities because abortion is healthcare. According to the CDC, Black women are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. Multiple factors contribute to these disparities, such as variation in quality healthcare, underlying chronic conditions, structural racism, and implicit bias. Black women, women of color, are already scared to have kids because their chances of getting a doctor that cares about them is low. Can we take a moment to really take that last part in? Women who are pregnant are literally dying because a doctor doesn't have the proper understanding of race, ethnicity, and cannot empathize. They're dying, they're in pain. That's why local orgs are so important. I urge you to look into organizations already doing the work. They know what they're doing, and their work directly impacts people's lives. While these politicians get their shit together, there's still people on the ground going through things that need our help. I recently listened to the Latino USA podcast. Episode name is On the Divide, Fighting for Choice in the Rio Grande Valley. It takes place in McAllen, Texas, where they only have one abortion provider serving 1 million people in the area. It follows 2 filmmakers, Maya Cueva and Leah Galant, journeys in creating a film that highlights the lived experiences of people in the community, also highlighting the religious aspects of this debate. I urge you to check that one out. Everyone's response to moments of injustice are different. I cry, I get sad, I get angry. Then I listen and observe. I cry again. I do research and probably post something that moves me on IG or that I feel is worth sharing. Then I learn some more. Then I'm moved to action. Everyone's form of action is different. Some people take to the streets. Others donate money. Some donate time. In any case, your voice matters. Many of us are probably used to sharing on social media because it's accessible. We're literally on it all day, every day. It's quite frankly often where I find stuff out first, and I'm not proud of that. And I try to supplement with podcasts, but day to day, puede que sea difícil. It can be hard. And consuming media with everything going on in the world can make you sad. Ignorance is bliss. Trust me, I've been there. Where I needed a break from the news because I felt that I couldn't take it. And what a privilege it is that I do that I can detach from something by simply just not turning on the news. To be like, let me disconnect. But sometimes that's truly needed to come back and aportar nuestro granito de arena. I thank social media for exposing me to different perspectives, but I can't stop there. We shouldn't. We can't depend on others to do the work for us. We have to care enough. We have to be sick and tired enough. We have to be angry enough. We have to be human and understand that my lived experience is different than yours, but that alone doesn't take away that your version of life is real. On sharing on social media, by the way, I shared a post on my personal IG that, to summarize, was from someone who works in the medical field, who mentioned that their trigger laws went into effect immediately after the decision. That day, they had a woman with an ectopic walk in at 11:30 p.m., and they had to wait to take care of her until the doctor could speak with a lawyer. Her ectopic ruptured and didn't get her procedure done for another 9 hours because the doctor was talking to the lawyer to try to find a workaround so that he wouldn't lose his license. By the time she was able to get treatment, she had already lost so much blood and almost died. The nurse mentioned that they were scared that they'd have to experience things like this at the hospital and lose people and be able to do nothing about it. I shared it thinking, no effing way this is happening. It was a frightening thought that doctors had to choose between saving a life or possibly losing their license. Then I learned that actually this stuff has already been happening in California, where some hospitals have to present any abortion to a moral review board. In some cases, if the hospital does this, someone may need to go to the nearest hospital that doesn't do this. And the nearest hospital, think about how many miles away that could be. I want to introduce you to the person that helped me realize truly my ignorance in the subject, Arieana Castellanos, aka Decolonized Puta on Instagram. Arieana Castellanos, aka Decolonized Puta, is a curandera, writer, artivist, counselor, and creative director. She's a bruja curandera practicing Mexican Purépecha healing, magic, and divination passed down from her grandmother. Arieana performs limpias, which are spiritual cleansings, and egg readings as well as tarot readings and herberia. Her abuela had a botanica in Fresno, California near Castillo's restaurant before the storefront was closed and has been working from home since. Her visual and written art is for activism to bring attention to social issues, and local visual and performing artists. She has a master's degree in social work, which she uses to provide therapy to children under 18 and their families through a nonprofit which employs and insures her. Arieana also uses her degree to stay engaged in city, state, national, and global social justice and advocacy work, as well as to ethically support people in healing. Arieana has an online botanica with a co-curandera. Her botanica's goal is to not only document and continue their own traditions and those of the cultures indígena which we come from, it is also to decolonize the advice we give our spirits and bodies. We come from cultures which have existed outside the current structures and institutions. As such, they work against neoliberal capitalism and modern-day greed so that our attitude of giving and generosity will build up local visual and performing artists, vendors, community resources, and human beings. Their endeavor is to deeply connect with the earth, using their harvests as food and medicine, giving thanks, being mindful to what is accessible to different communities, and staying committed to collaborating with local small farmers, growers, and vendors.
Decolonized Puta was something that kind of came about when I was in college. And I was sort of trying to figure out where I felt about certain things and kind of like where I landed on certain things. And I was also going through a lot of like transformative processes. Like I had gotten out of a really long-term relationship that was just like really challenging for lots of reasons. And then I sort of like had a lot of challenges on the dating scene afterwards too, that just kind of like changed my perspective and had a lot of relation to the work that I was doing with survivors and with gendered and sexual violence. And so it just kind of marked, I feel like, this very big transitional point for me. where I was kind of trying on different like ways of talking about my experience, also trying not to um, create a space that lived just in the trauma narrative, and just kind of like, how is this connected to everything happening around us, and where do we go from here? Especially because so much of like the programming that's out there is just like so fear-based, both in like the urgency to fight injustices, and also like the ways that we're conditioned and taught to be complicit in injustices happening around us. So I just wanted a space that was also going to be holistic for all the different ways that healing happens. And healing doesn't just happen by talking about what's happened. You know, we process through poetry, through art, through movement. So I just really wanted a space that embodied that. And that's kind of how Decolonized Putas was born. And it just kind of was a reminder that I'm also not alone, and that there are so many women that have been through similar experiences, some that choose to speak out about them and some that don't. And the ways that like we're all connected through not just what we've been through, but our desire to want to make things better for the next generation of people coming through. And so that's kind of where Decolonized Putas came from. And it's just also really important to me because one thing about the word puta is that you really don't have to do a whole lot to qualify as puta. You really just need to be making a man angry. And that's something that Elizabeth Vasquez, she's a Puerto Rican poet, she writes a little bit about that. And I've also kind of seen it play out, you know, sometimes in counseling spaces, like I've seen just one person call someone else a puta just kind of for showing emotion. And so I think that being our raw, authentic selves can elicit such big reactions from other people that it's so easy to want to push that away from ourselves. And this is just kind of one way of like really being in people's spaces of like, yeah, you know, we live in a world where in a lot of ways it feels like they're using legislation to regulate my body. So I think in a lot of ways I use my body to regulate legislation. So the way that I take up space online and in real life, that's what Decolonized Puta is about for me. And the way that shows up in the Botanica is, you know, me and my homegirl really try to stay true to plant medicine. And even when we try to like expand, it always comes back to the plants. It's always coming back to the yerbas. But that was born from both of our grandmas being curanderas and kind of doing this work in Mexico and then bringing it here in the United States, either through family immigrating or through themselves coming here. So part of it too was also just kind of us picking up that journey in grad school, because we were not necessarily feeling like social work that in the way that we were learning it was fulfilling the need that we had to show up for our community, especially when it came to making services accessible, and also with like bridging community gaps. That was something that we saw was really challenging for a social work field. And also there was a lot of rigidity in the social work field, and Botanica has a little bit less of that. It's more fluid. Like sometimes we would be showing up at a high school campus to vend and, you know, introduce young people to herbs and seeds and planting. And sometimes we'd be showing up at a rave and helping people quit smoking. So it really just kind of depended on where people wanted us, but we wanted to show up and be an accepting and safe space for people, and remind people that plants are always an accepting and safe space for people, and that we're in connection with them and that we're in connection with the earth. So we do that through community building and communal care. So we try to uplift the voices of other vendors, of other community organizations that are doing the work. We try to donate some of our proceeds to community organizations doing movement work. And that's how we stay connected to folks. We offer healing services as well through the Botanica, so people can get connected with their spiritual practice and with themselves.
Sharing on social media can feel like the least we could do, but in doing so, I learned a lesson. We need to be mindful about all of the information circulating around. I can't imagine living in a world that doesn't give me a choice over my body and what I do with it. ¿Qué les importa? But that frustration over actual lived experience is a privilege. I can't pretend to know what it's like to know the experience of having gone to a clinic to get an abortion. Even before this ruling, women have had it difficult. It's important to stay educated, stay open, and stay learning. Ariana shares her thoughts on sharing on social media and how we can make it truly impactful.
Yeah, I think social media has been a really huge tool in like spreading information. I think something that we have all done is sort of dismissed the same characteristics that people stereotype boomers for in terms of like misinformation and like believing whatever they see on Facebook. Or like as millennials and Gen Z, I think we have that with Instagram and TikTok. So I don't think that we're necessarily immune to it just because we were born in the age of information and technology. I think that our thinking that maybe we're immune to it is part of what gets us in a bind, because it's definitely, something I've done before too. And I think a huge part of it is also maybe this like illusion that California or that certain states are really progressive. And I think when we look at actual policy and then we look at the ways that it's actually showing up, so the praxis, like the actual like theory and practice, the law and practice, what is it actually doing? So I can think of like two examples that maybe are shocking to people. One would be that gay marriage was banned twice in California during our lifetime, once in 2000 and once in 2008. So on two separate things. So that was that whole like yes on Prop 8. That's like, if you remember that from being a middle schooler, then you should definitely be using face cream. But just like the ways that, like, the conversation was like your kid is going to come home and ask you about gay marriage, and it was just like the messaging was almost like, if you don't want your kids to be asking you about things, you should vote no on this, you should vote yes on this. I don't remember what I think yes on 8 was banning it. But it's one of those things of like, we're so scared to just talk to people about things. And kids really have such a much more broader understanding of things because they're just a lot less rigid. They haven't quite developed the same black and white thinking that we have. They're learning that and they're picking up on that. But even so, the ban did go into effect. Like in 2008, the proposition did pass, and gay marriage was banned, and it was overturned only because like of a federal technicality. And then that overturning, like lifting the ban, didn't actually happen until 2013. So we're looking at like less than a decade that everybody in California has been able to access gay marriage, right? And so I think when we actually step back and look at chronologically what's been happening, then it's easier to see there's actually so much more injustice is happening in my own community, not just in some red state in the Midwest that's hard for me to contextualize on a map. And I think a lot of that, again, comes from people not talking about what's happening, people not talking about their experience trying to get an abortion, even if it's not necessarily an abortion that was meant to terminate the pregnancy. Sometimes abortion is medical care because the pregnancy is not viable. There is no chance, like in an ectopic pregnancy, where the egg is on a fallopian tube, it will not have the nutrient, it will not have the connection to the body to grow into a baby. And so what needs to happen is an abortion. That medical procedure at some hospitals needs to be proven to a review board, a moral review board, as to here's why we have to do this abortion. And so when we think about that in the context of California, that can be like really shocking. And I think that one of the biggest things that we skip over in movement work is just the grief process, like the 5 stages of grief of like anger and bargaining and denial and depression, sadness and acceptance. And just kind of like, how do I reckon with the fact that this isn't necessarily the world that I'm not living in the world that I want to be in, like society doesn't function the way I want to, but also that's a lot closer to me than I thought. And so I think that it's really difficult when we don't have a way to grieve the way that we thought, our community functions, that we thought our community was safer than it was. And I think there's things that can happen as a result of that. People can become like paralyzed in their fear or overwhelm around, what do I do next? But I think there can also be a stillness, of like, all right, so then what do I do next? So then what does that mean for me and my people? How do I make sure that, maybe what after learning that, you're so enraged and you're like, I want to show up and be an abortion doula. I want to show up and support people who are going to have abortions. I want to support them when they're there. I want to support them afterwards. Maybe you can't do that and you want to donate. Maybe you can't do that and you want to go to a protest. Maybe you can't do that and you want to make some food for folks and just like put in the Facebook group about it, like, hey, made some meals for folks that have just had abortions. If you want to throw them in the freezer, here's the ingredients. But it's really just also important to think about, like, yeah, this is really overwhelming, to learn about injustices in my community, and then finding cooperatives and collectives that are showing up to city council meetings, that are showing up to different actions. That's really helpful because city council meetings are, I would say that local government is some of the most important things that people can get involved with. And that usually does involve a good amount of public speaking. It involves, if you're not showing up by yourself, then it involves showing up with a group that maybe gives you a paper of like, I'm with so-and-so collective today, and I, am co-signing their 3 demands, which are blah, blah, blah. And if you put your personal spin on it, then maybe you're talking about like your personal experience witnessing or experiencing injustice in your community. There's been times where in Hayward, I can show up and during city council meetings say, I'm a homeowner and these are my concerns. And then all of a sudden, I'm being taken more seriously in the space. So just being able to like leverage the privilege that you have in different spaces is really important. But then it's just a really great way to get like consistent involvement that you can pace out. Like, I can do this. I can show up to this thing. And maybe you're also being invited to outings and you can like build community and have like that joy and that rest in between and feel like, okay, last week I went to 2 meetings, this week I got a lot to do. I can't make it out to stuff. And all of a sudden it feels a little bit easier to show up and do this. Cause we're in it for the long haul. The work that people did for civil rights before us, I think we see it as like they fought the fight and it's really an ongoing thing. And so knowing that for the long haul, we're going to have to be rested and it's going to look different every day. Some days it's going to be a small change in someone's life. And on a different day, it's going to be speaking at a city council meeting or showing up to a protest or, feeding a group of people.
If you're outraged by this ruling because now you feel like it personally impacts you, that's something to dive deeper into your soul about. Why does it personally have to impact you for you to care? I do think, however, that adding your voice to the narrative adds even more voice to the movement. If you're able to put a meaningful message together that influences just one person, you've already done something. I don't care what anyone says. We're all influencers, and you don't need to have even 10K followers to be it. If you're anything like me, sometimes we lean on reposting because we can't actually put words together to describe how we feel, where we stand, or the right words to properly express. I've learned that the most impactful thing to do is that research and show up as what we are, emotional beings that care and may not have it all right, but care enough to learn. I asked Decolonized Puta if she's ever been met with resistance in the work that she does. She says that for the most part, people have been receptive and they sort of know what to expect.
Yeah, I think people see our signage and decide for themselves almost immediately whether or not our table's for them. So I think like some of that kind of happens, it filters itself. But most of the time, honestly, I'm pretty pleasantly surprised by how willing people are to chat or to learn about what we're doing. A lot of people will just kind of like walk up to the table and be like, explain to me what's happening here, And so we just kind of like jump in, like, do you have questions? Are you seeing something that you have questions about? We like to put plants out so that people can smell them. And so part of that is also us like infusing some of the therapeutic work in there of like helping people take a deep breath before they come across maybe some information that might be challenging to their worldview or their perspective. And ultimately, most people haven't necessarily had any resistance in the spaces that we've been invited to. I can speak for myself and say that like when I've been in spaces that maybe have been traditionally more Christian, I have had a lot of my own stuff come up, and yet those spaces don't receive me in the way that I thought. Like they receive me with open arms, and they're just like, yeah, we're glad you're here. I'm glad you're showing up. And so I think a lot of that sometimes is our own perspective and our own mindset getting in the way, and our own fear getting in the way.
As she's saying this, I immediately think of the fact that most of our fears around public speaking come from fear of judgment, from our audience when they probably don't even care. I mean, they care about what you're saying, of course, but you know what I mean? Sometimes the biggest lesson we can learn to gain confidence in public speaking is realizing that it's not all about us. Arieana is such a great public speaker and advocate in her community, so I wanted to ask her about the first time she remembers speaking in public and how public speaking shows up today in the work that she does.
Yeah, some of my first experiences with public speaking were more like public recitation. And I did like a lot of like readings at church or like at this thing called Peach Blossom, where you're just like reciting like poetry in front of like large groups of people and they're like judging how your group did. But in terms of like public speaking, like presenting information that I came up with or found, one of my first memories of doing that was a presentation on Harriet Tubman. And it was just like, I don't know, I just feel like I was I was learning so much, but I learned about her as an herbalist and someone who like used just kind of whatever herbs and plants were in whatever part of the country she was in to help people with like ailments along the way and to help like babies go to sleep so that they wouldn't like wake up or draw attention to themselves in the Underground Railroad. And she herself had narcolepsy, so she was disabled. And so it was just like really interesting for that to be one of my first memories of like public speaking. um but yeah, for the most part, like class presentations, um and beyond that, it was also in church spaces where I'd be speaking at a retreat and just kind of like, even then, doing some sort of like decolonizing of like people's relationship with their spirituality and trying to like remove some of that like shame and guilt that is so common in the Catholic Church. My family grew up Catholic, and so there's a lot of spaces where I was always fighting or speaking against that. I think in my work, day to day, it has reminded me that I'm always learning, and just kind of like being okay to speak on the fact that I'm a lifelong learner. And that's, I think, more in relation to the work that I do for Decolonized Puta as a brand, in terms of like beginning at my desire for kind of like women's rights and gendered and sexual violence. Then it kind of like expanded to understanding like the way the larger systems affect everybody, and just kind of like people that are unhoused and undocumented, and just kind of like environmental racism. I was able to use public speaking to talk about the ways they're connected. And I think I went through this learning phase of like my own sense of urgency and the way that was reflected in a lot of public speaking spaces. And now I'm able to come from a place of trying to center what we can do, and just not just kind of like the alarmist of like, yeah, here's what's happening now. Because I think I started to realize that there were so many things happening in communities I was part of, that either I was talking over people that were in my community and I wasn't listening to their needs, or they weren't given necessarily a space to begin with, to express their needs, or a platform to express their needs. So I think in terms of the brand, that's how public speaking has shown up and evolved for me. In terms of like my career wise, it's different on any day. You know, there are times where I'm in a meeting and there's a child welfare worker there, and they're just kind of like evaluating how the family has done, and maybe kind of coming down hard a little bit on the family. And then it's an opportunity to say, hey, actually, the family's been doing a lot. Like, this is a lot of work to do, and here's what the family has been doing. And just being able to like advocate for families. Sometimes that means channeling all the work that I've done and writing up like a summary of services that's going to go for a school psychologist, or it's going to go in front of a judge for their immigration case, or it's going to go in front of a judge for a criminal case. You know, then what I'm saying has to be like not just succinct, but also confidential and respectful to the client's process and trauma. And so it's a collaborative experience, but also I think a really like spiritual and reverent opportunity to think about the way that I want to speak about this client's experience and my work with them. And oftentimes, you know, I have to present cases to my supervisor every week, and then every once in a while to group supervision. And so I have to be able to collect the information. In group supervision, I'm lucky enough that we have it all in Spanish, which is really hard to find at agencies. So I get to present the cases in Spanish. A lot of my cases are Spanish speaking monolingual families. So it's helpful to be able to contextualize some of this, not just in a bilingual group, but in a bicultural group. So those things, I think, in terms of my career and the brand, that's how public speaking comes in handy. And then I think for the Botanica, it just kind of comes with like being versatile. Like sometimes there's a kid showing up at, the table and they're just like, what's this? And we want to be able to like give them something they can take with them. And sometimes it's someone showing up, it's an adult, like, what is this? We're just like, well, it's a lot of things.
Now, what about public speaking as activism?
In terms of public speaking for like protests or like more organizer movements like that, I think it just really depends on the space. Sometimes it's a party, where we're like, there's food, there's vendors, there's live performances, there's art, and we're celebrating. And then all of a sudden, this stuff is, the money is going to go to whatever cause, and we're all showing up, and maybe you're just kind of speaking on the spot, and you're like having to say a couple good words. So I think one thing that's come in handy is times when I've had to present to funders in my career. You come up with like two things that you can say and elaborate on because you've got like 60 seconds, maybe 120 seconds to speak. So some of those on the spot kind of tips have helped me also in some of the organizer spaces. In some of the like protest spaces, I think it's a little bit more challenging because that's usually a time of really high emotion, of really high stress, of really high risk. And so people's feelings, emotions, bodies, and sensations are in such different places. And that energy is contagious. So a lot of that work is more about like, for me, being grounded and, reminding people that we're all there because we're fighting for each other. Like we believe in the dignity and humanity of each other to the point that we're showing up to care for each other today. So that energy has to guide me in those moments because it's really easy for me to get lost in the energy of the crowd. Especially if there's like if it happens to be an action where there's risk, then it becomes like, all right, how do we show up and do this safely and also speak about the issues that are important?
But it doesn't stop there. We all have something to contribute, something that we can do to aportar nuestro granito de arena. Arieana talks about finding what will work for you, what you're good at, and how to use that strength to organize. The audio gets a little choppy here, but bear with us. It's good stuff.
I think that starts with like asking ourselves like a couple key questions. Like, what skills do I have? What communities am I part of? What skills do these communities need? Maybe what things do I need? Because I think one of the easiest places to get involved is to start to get to know your neighbors. That feels, I think, so difficult. And I think it's one of like the many public speaking events that we get to have in our lives. And I'm thinking back to like sociologist Goffman, who talks about like all of these things being performances. And so all of these things are just rehearsals. It's not the final curtain call. It's never the final curtain call. I know it feels that way all the time, but they're all just rehearsals. And so like the more we practice being able to talk to each other, that's I think one of the biggest places that I would like recommend people starting is just like getting to know your neighbors, whether that's like the people that you commute with, whether that's the people that you live with, whether that's people you share an apartment building with, or that you frequent restaurants with. But building community in that way and figuring out like, yeah, what skills do I have? Because for example, like so much goes into protests, like you said, feeding people before the protest, or jail support plans. Like, there has to be folks at home calling each other, making sure that people know what's going on, who's where, and how are people getting home safely. And so really understanding that there's a network of people involved with any organization, any action. And most of the time, like, for example, I can think of like anti-police terror project, like some of the protests and actions they've organized have been like sit-ins against the curfew, right? Where it's like the curfew is the most damaging to communities of color and people that work like night shifts, don't work traditional 9 to 5s. So like that's one way that they chose to show up, because there are people, for example, that are undocumented that can't necessarily show up to the actions in the same way. And so I think that's really easy to miss that there's someone in your community that needs the skill that you have. And so that's true also of like maybe stuff that you own. So some people, in getting to know their neighbors, try to like build a community tool shed. You know, that's like one of the main ways that you can start to like create this network of people who are consolidating resources, and are also connecting with each other to like, hey, do you have this tool? I need this tool for this project. Maybe over time you're able to like barter a service, you know, like maybe you're able to cut hair in exchange for an oil change, like really whatever takes the burden off of having to show up for systems that sometimes harm us. Like I know a lot of women that have anxiety about going to the mechanic. So, you know, if you can go to someone that you trust and that, you know, is in your neighborhood, then that's one way to feel less isolated. But also like the work that you do and the skills that you do matter and contribute to the work, whether like you're a hairdresser or a mechanic or a coder or an accountant. So those would be like my recommendations of like where people can start to get involved with their community issues. Because then maybe you start to learn about like things that people are concerned about and ways to address that in your neighborhood. Like if there's people always speeding through your neighborhood and you think about, you know, you have a really big street, you know, like we could actually fit a roundabout in here. Like roundabouts don't delay emergency services. You know, it wouldn't cost a whole lot. It wouldn't, you know, it's not more electricity. It would bring more green space to the area. So if you can kind of get enough people to sign a petition, then you can send that over to city council. And now like all together, you've done this thing for your neighborhood, brought more green space, lowered the heat in the area, and also made it safer for people to be outside and be in community with each other. So I think like it's really difficult to show up when you have already a goal like that big in mind. So I definitely like recommend people starting with like just getting to know each other, because things happen, you know, like sometimes there's a wild animal in the backyard and you're like, hey neighbor, FYI, the possum's eating your garden. Like at some point, like we want to be able to just check in with each other and be like, hey, or I'm going out of town, can you keep an eye on the house? Like, you know, just things like that where we can all feel safer to like do the things that we want to do.
This is about community. When she mentioned that, hey, there may be some things that you are less comfortable with doing or feel unsafe doing, but I may have the privilege of not feeling unsafe in these spaces, let me do this for you. Like, that's a form of organizing, and it's a way that we can contribute nuestro granito de arena daily. And catch this, y'all. Decolonized Puta actually has a bit of a series on her Instagram called Bait and Switch, where she posts a picture of herself, followed by a thread of ways to get involved. Let's hear from her what exactly she has in mind when she creates this.
So I just really will use any tactic to get people to look at injustices in the world. And sometimes that means, I guess that's going back to like, you know, decolonized puta. And I want to quote Samira Rahim. She's the girl at Pride that gets interviewed, and she's like, I'm a slut. Yep, that's me. I'm a slut. My body is not a political playground. My body is mine. And so in those moments where I think like as a woman, I'm always objectified. Like it's not really something I get to decide. Like, you know, even if I'm wearing a burlap sack, I'm like, how today did I get someone's attention? Like I really tried hard not to draw any attention. So it's one of those moments of like, well, if you're gonna look anyway, why don't you look over here at what's happening and look at something important? At least something that's important to me. And I think that for me, I also want to quote like Brittany Cooper. She wrote Eloquent Rage. And so she talks about like as much as decolonization is really important, you know, it's not necessarily about like burning everything down or crumbling it all. Even though it is going to be a struggle, you know, it's not going to happen peacefully. It's not going to be a peaceful transition of giving power to the people. It's going to be an uphill battle, and that's kind of what we're seeing with Roe v. Wade. That's kind of what we're seeing with, you know, trans LGBTQ rights. That's what we're seeing with women's rights in general. That's what we're seeing with racism and environmental protections, and just our own legal protections and civil liberties. And so like that stuff can be really scary. And Brittany Cooper writes like there is a way that we can come in, not guns blazing the way colonizers do, but really show up to rebuild what's not working. And so when we start to rebuild something to the point that we replace it, we make it obsolete, right? We make a better version of it. We make a new version of it, but we have to imagine that together. And so part of it is people have to be thinking about these things. So bait and switch is kind of like, yep, here's my face. Here's me doing something maybe a little bit provocative. now that I have your attention, let's talk about the rights that you're losing, because pretty soon you're not going to be able to look at my naked body. I don't know, just kind of, just kind of ways of like, not scaring people of like, hey, you're losing your rights, but like, hey, there's something to be concerned about here. And now that I have your attention, let's talk about it. So bait and switch is that, and it's also a way to just kind of like beat the algorithm. And I think it's also a way to like imagine a new way of showing up. One of my inspirations that I met at Cal, her name is Misa Dang, and she, to my knowledge, coined the term thought scholar activist. And I just like, when I saw that, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I can be all three at the same time. Like there is really no reason that I cannot exist in this way all the time. I don't have to mask or hide it. I am kind of all these things, whether or not I want to be, right? On any given day. Like I said, all you need to do is be yourself. And then there's a man calling you a puta. So I think that just kind of like embracing that, and also saying like, I'm not afraid of my body, what it looks like, what it feels like, other people's reactions to it. And I'm also not afraid of talking about what's not working in our society, because I'm committed to changing it for everyone's sake, not just mine.
Change for everyone's sake, not just yours. And listen to what Arieana says about spiritual activism and boundaries. This blew my mind, y'all.
Spiritual activism for me is just like, this is a daily practice. Like it's part of like my spirituality. It's something that I bring into every space. And most of the time it has a lot to do with like my own rituals and routines and practices. Like, how do I stay present? How do I stay regulated? How do I notice how things feel in my body? Because a lot of that kind of leads the way for how I can make change in my family, in community spaces, in the larger global context. Because a lot of us are kind of conditioned not to listen to our bodies. Like so many of us are walking around exhausted. So many of us were like going to work sick before COVID. So many of us walk around hungry. So just like we're so just conditioned to ignore that or work through it. And so like spiritual activism is like a reminder to, eat when you're hungry and rest when you're tired. And just kind of a recognition that we're humans and we make mistakes. And so when I'm noticing in my body that there's a certain communication style in my family that doesn't feel good, maybe my initial reaction is to have like a visceral reaction and, start to bicker. We have a lot of strong female personalities in my family where we have a very big matriarchal line. And so one way that I can show up is also thinking about like the ways that colonialism and injustices have affected and impacted my family and kind of created this dynamic. And so ultimately, I'm thinking about one writer who talks about like mutual aid as a factor of evolution. Because even like Darwin, like natural selection wasn't even about like inner species. It was about like other species and each other. And he wrote like, hey guys, you guys are taking this out of context. Like he wrote his own follow-up. So I think like in terms of spiritual activism, it's also understanding that we have like this learned scarcity, this like learned lack mindset, where we're like always trying to like get people to do what we want them to do, or like get an outcome, or like have something show up a certain way, because we're afraid of not having it, or we've like gone without it for so long and we've like maybe idealized like what it would be like to have this. And so we're always reacting to like, I want to be talked to this way, I want to be treated this way. And I think we're not really listening to like, well, what doesn't feel good about this, and can I speak to that behavior more? Like, boundaries I think are really challenging when we talk about like, it's not necessarily you're not going to talk to me that way. It's I don't stay in conversations where people talk to me in that way because it's really uncomfortable for me, right? Where like that becomes a spiritual practice of like, I'm actually, if this conversation continues the way it's going, I'm going to have to walk away. Like I want you to know right now that I can't stay here in this conversation. It's really hard for me. And I think we should take a break and talk about it in a different time where it seems easier for both of us. Because right now it seems very hard for me. So being able to say that, that's activism in that moment. Because the reality is being in community with people doesn't mean that you're friends with everybody. So I think that's where a lot of people maybe get off, is thinking like, dang, I'm not clicking with any of these people in this space. And that's kind of the point, is to understand people's needs that are so different from yours, and being aware that, yeah, we can celebrate the differences, we can be aware of our differences, but so much of our identity is like made to highlight our differences, and it's made to like hide the fact that we have more in common with each other as collective power, as laborers, as people who are experiencing injustices. And that's why oftentimes a lot of spaces that radicalize people are labor unions, because that's when people across racial lines, across citizenship, across disabilities, across experiences, across sexual preferences and gender identities realize that I have more in common with the people here than I do with sometimes even my own family. My own family doesn't necessarily understand why my work is so difficult, why my job is so difficult, why I'm always tired, but these people here do. And if I can show up with them and unite with them, right? And a union, the word union can be kind of loaded for some people, but if I can get together and unite with them and maybe get a common goal accomplished, then what else can we do? And so I think that that's the way that it's like spiritual, is that it looks different every day.
Are you interested in continuing your decolonization work and learning about the resources that Decolonized Puta offers?
So people can find me at Decolonized Puta on social media, or through Botanica Miel y Amor, if you're interested in those services or the things we've got going on there. We also have a website, botanicamielyamor.com, and the information that I share for Decolonized Puta is on Instagram, but also on a website at decolonizedputas.wordpress.com. And I think one thing that would be really great for people to start with is there's a guide on like independence for all that I sort of share every 4th of July. And it's something that I contributed to with a lot of other collaborators. And it kind of talks about like, yeah, what do we do now that we've pulled the curtain back and we're seeing all the injustices? And it's got a guide, it's got playlists, it's got trivia, it's got like if you're a parent and you're parenting during, this civil unrest. So it's got like ways that you might want to talk to other people about it. It's got like a whole list of like books and resources to start like some of your own learning. And I also have a Google Doc I'm happy to provide to you that's got a list of free audiobooks that are very leftist, but definitely shed light on some of the things that I talked about today. And in terms of decolonization, I would recommend reading Frantz Fanon. He's a psychiatrist and sociologist who coined that term. And he really writes a lot about like, it's not enough for the colonizers to be gone, because when they leave behind what they brought. And instead of us just tearing it all down, we actually just take their place and continue to recreate that harm. So I think some of the most important things that we can do is unlearn the conditioning that we have, and figuring out, as Miriam Kava would say, jailbreak the imagination. Like, not just because of our conditioning, but also because scientifically trauma does affect the way that we can imagine the world. Does affect our brain, and the only way to break that up is through positive interactions. Like, that's scientifically the only way to change the harm that trauma has done to the brain, is through joy. So I really hope that whatever people take away from this, they remember how important it is to have joy and rest.
I believe and know that public speaking brings people together. I realize that my granito de arena is in the area of public speaking and elevating others to help them use their voices to advocate in the ways that are true to them. I want to spend the remaining of this podcast episode reminding you of some key elements of public speaking as activism, so that you can confidently use your voice to affect change in your communities, whether that community is online, within the four walls of your home, or beyond. Wherever you are and whatever your resources are, we can all do something. One of the most powerful uses of public speaking is bringing people together around a common cause. We've seen this throughout history. I could say in the United States, but really everywhere around the world. Leaders, preachers, activists, politicians, nuestras abuelas, abuelos, tías. They have used the spoken word to inspire and motivate, to challenge us, to help us envision a better world. And so when we're thinking about having this impact on our communities, here are some things that I think we should keep in mind. your audience. Ask yourselves questions like, who are you talking to and what is the point? Are you, as one would say, preaching to the choir? Meaning people that you know already believe in your cause and you want to inspire them to act? Are you public speaking to a room full of lawmakers who may or may not be out of touch? Are you having a conversation with people of the complete opposite moral standpoint who don't even want to hear what you have to say? Who is your audience and what is your platform? You're essentially trying to mold your message to interests, level of understanding, attitudes, and beliefs. You know how we often talk about a people-centric approach? This is very similar. What you say goes back to who your audience is. And listen, there are some impromptu speeches that sometimes just have to be said, but even then, you'll realize that you've done this analysis. Before speaking, you likely already know how the people in the room feel about what you're going to say, what their interest level is, what their attitude towards your message is. Have you heard of the phrase, there's a time and place? When it comes to public speaking as activism, sometimes any and all stages are the right time and place. Sometimes you may be a part of something organized where you're speaking to politicians and lawmakers. These need to be more calculated because no matter what you say, if the goal is to get them to change their mind or act, you simply have to deliver the message appropriately for their ears, for them to really listen, even using their language. Sometimes to fight against injustice, you have to be first heard, and the only way to do that is to speak in a way that will make them listen and command respect. You're speaking their language while sharing your message. You may also want to consider the size of the group you're talking to. Usually when you give speeches to large groups, they require a lot more preparation. But let's say you're speaking to a group of 4 people. You can be a little less formal, quote formal, right? What works for the thousands will not work for the 4 people. There are different techniques to apply here. No matter what you do, your activism needs to consider your audience. I'll bring this up only because I've seen a lot of it. There are many white women who, rightfully so, are outraged by the Supreme Court ruling and are taking to TikTok to express that, even showing us how we can report the US to the UN, tactics for getting out of certain situations legally, etc. Even a conversation about why Black women aren't being more vocal. To which Black women and women of color have responded like, we've been working on this. It impacts you now, so now you want to be involved? It's also telling that these resources are shared with people now, but when it solely involved Black and brown communities, their activism wasn't present. The point is, when you're speaking to an audience in whatever format, consider their lived experiences, their knowledge, and their level of involvement to understand what approach to take. Consider that your experience isn't the only one, and that in fact your audience may know more than you. So again, let's do the research, let's engage in conversations, and let's offer our help where we can to the people that have already been doing this work for years. Now we have that audience part piece, and that's incredibly important. What follows has everything to do with you. Let's take a look at body language. You may or may not have heard of this before, but some of the basics around body language for public speaking include this. Keep a good posture, stand straight with shoulders back, relaxed and feet shoulders width apart. Do not cross your arms, put your hands in your pocket or slouch. Face the audience as much as possible and keep your body open. To me, the most important reason for paying attention to your body language is connection. It helps bridge a gap because physically you're standing in front of people or you have their attention as an audience member. It can be intimidating. Your body language builds trust in that you know what you're talking about, but also humanizes you. What comes naturally will generally be good, but when you want to really focus on bringing people to action, springing them to action, here are some things I'd suggest you keep in mind. I learned this from an article that I read on wearenative.com. I'll leave this article linked in the description of this podcast episode for reference because I think it talks about safe body language in a little bit of a different context, but I think we can apply it to public speaking and public speaking as activism as well. They talk about safe body language and they mention how our body language can and should be dependent on what is culturally appropriate, which makes sense. As a Latina who grew up hearing stories and listening to people who move their hands a lot when they speak, it's what feels comfortable. I mean, I'm recording this podcast, no one is here, but I'm still moving my hands as I speak. I want you all to know that. And it's also a sense of comfort for me. I trust people when I see this type of movement. I really do. They need to think about personal space. How far away or close are you to someone? Are you comfortable? Are they comfortable with that space? Touch. Touching can be a sign of comfort and trust building, but you have to also be careful with this because some people may actually not be comfortable with it. Generally, if you're up on a stage, you'll want to consider being open. That's my go-to stance. In whatever speech you're giving, you want to remain open because that indicates that you're open to conversations, new perspectives, community building. Next, I want to talk about voice control, which to be honest can be hard when you become emotional and you're giving a speech about something that you're really passionate about, but even that can help you get your message across. An article in The Guardian titled How to Be Heard, The Art of Public Speaking walks us through some studies about the things that make people listen to you. According to research presented in this article, there's a lingering subconscious association between deep voices and leadership. Quote, one study of 792 male chief executives in affiliation with Duke University found the ones with lower voices led larger companies and made more money. Prejudice also lingers around regional accents, with the BBC political correspondent Chris Mason recently admitting he was told as a young journalist that he'd never get on the radio with his Yorkshire Dalesburg. While the shadow education secretary, Angela Rayner, is dogged on social media by people suggesting her Mancunian vowels somehow make her sound thick. I can't even believe this, but these things are real. If you have a deep voice, you're subconsciously deemed a good leader. If you don't, you may not be taken as seriously. If you have an accent, people may judge you based on that, and it sucks. And that's why understanding your voice and how you use it can be so important in public speaking for activism. You're passionate about it already. What things can you emphasize? What things must you change your tone for? This is our most important tool as public speakers. I read that breathing from your belly will help you access your most powerful voice. So let's try that. Breathing from your diaphragm. Next, these are 5 things that we should consider controlling in our voices when we're giving speeches. It's the volume, the pitch, the speed, and pausing. Volume is all about how loud you are. Are you speaking loud enough for people in the back to hear? This is especially important if you don't have a mic. Pitch is all about how your voice goes up and down in pitch. If you don't vary it throughout your presentation, it can be very monotone and you can lose people's interest more quickly. Find the moments of passion and emotion and use those to influence your voice inflections. Speed is all around how quickly you are speaking. Is it too slow? Is it too fast? You got to give people some time to catch up. You got to give people an understanding of what you're saying, but also don't want to make it so boring by speaking slowly. And honestly, sometimes that's what happens. If you speak too slowly, you start to lose your audience. If you speak too quickly, you lose your audience. So find that perfect in between. And pausing. Are you taking advantage of those pauses to catch your breath, but also to help avoid unhelpful and unnecessary filler words? And I really want you to hear these things being put into practice, so keep an eye out for a YouTube video over on my channel, Chats with Yvonne, where I watch moments in time where powerful activists use these techniques to impact change in the world. I'll go into depth around the techniques that they use and why they're so effective. We'll also cover more recent forms of activism in the form of spoken word. With all of that being said, I want to leave you with affirmations to guide your journey in using public speaking as activism. You are making an impact. You are deserving of rest. I see you for who you are, and that person is powerful beyond measure. Show up for your people. Shine your light. It's what we all need to do right now. More of your light, the light that only you can use to illuminate the world. Thank you for being here and listening to the Chats with Yvonne podcast. Let's chat again next week. Adios, everybody.